Sergeant Marcus Webb had seen some impressive things in his 5 years of military service, but nothing had prepared him for the grand assembly hall of the Concordia Prime. The diplomatic vessel was roughly the size of a small moon, designed by committee, and apparently built by beings who thought physics was more of a suggestion than a law. The walls were made of some kind of crystalline material that shifted colors like a mood ring having an identity crisis, currently displaying what Marcus hoped was peaceful negotiation, blue rather than imminent catastrophe, red. He stood at attention with the rest of the human diplomatic security detail, trying not to gawk at the assembled representatives from 47 different star systems. To his left, a delegation of beings that looked like walking jellyfish were having what appeared to be a very animated conversation through rapid color changes, while to his right, something that resembled a cross between a tree and a filing cabinet was methodically organizing what might have been documents or possibly lunch. "Remember," Captain Rodriguez had briefed them earlier, "we're here to look professional, not to stare at the aliens like tourists at a zoo. Humanity's application for coalition membership depends on us making a good impression." Marcus adjusted his dress uniform and tried to look like he belonged in a room where the laws of physics were apparently negotiable. The gravity generators were working overtime to accommodate species that ranged from beings who needed 3 times Earth gravity to function properly, to others who preferred to float in gas clouds. The result was a fascinating but nauseating experience where up and down were relative concepts, and his inner ear was filing formal complaints. The atmospheric processors hummed with the efficiency of machines trying very hard not to accidentally poison anyone, cycling through 47 different breathing mixtures while maintaining temperature ranges that somehow kept everyone from either freezing or spontaneously combusting. Marcus had been warned that the air might taste a bit strange, but nobody had mentioned it would have the flavor profile of metallic flowers mixed with ozone, and what could only be described as mathematical anxiety. A musical tone that somehow managed to be harmonic in frequencies his ears weren't designed to hear announced the beginning of the ceremony. The assembled delegates turned their attention, eyes, sensory organs, and in one case what appeared to be a small radar dish, toward the central dais where the Coalition Council would soon take their places. Marcus had studied the briefing materials until his eyes bled, but seeing the Coalition leadership in person was like reading about waterfalls and then standing under Niagara. The Vorthan Chancellor moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd evolved in 3-dimensional space, their 6 limbs allowing them to navigate the complex geometry of the dais with movements that looked like interpretive dance. The Cromulon ambassador's crystalline carapace caught the shifting light from the walls, creating patterns that probably meant something important in their culture, but mostly made Marcus think of very expensive jewelry having an argument with a prism. Then Queen Lyrale of the Etherian Empire made her entrance, and Marcus forgot about breathing for several seconds. She moved like poetry written by someone who understood the fundamental equations of grace, each step precise and purposeful, yet somehow flowing like water. Her silver-blue hair caught the light and seemed to hold it, creating a subtle luminescence that made the air around her shimmer. But it was her ears that marked her as unmistakably Etherian, elongated and pointed. They curved gracefully upward like ancient elven depictions, occasionally twitching with what Marcus was learning to recognize as signs of concentration or emotion. Her presence filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. When she took her place among the Coalition Council, the ambient noise in the assembly hall dropped by several decibels, as if 47 different species had collectively decided that whatever was about to happen required their full attention. Marcus tried to focus on his duties, which mainly consisted of standing still and looking alert while scanning for potential security threats in a room full of beings whose idea of a friendly greeting might involve electrical discharge or telepathic probes. His enhanced tactical awareness, honed through years of military training, cataloged exits, identified potential cover positions, and noted the locations of what appeared to be the room's defensive systems, though he wasn't entirely sure which of the decorative elements were actually decorative and which were sophisticated weapons platforms. The opening ceremony began with what the briefing materials had called the traditional coalition greeting of worlds, which turned out to be a complex ritual involving harmonic frequencies that made Marcus's teeth itch. Bioluminescent displays that painted the assembly hall in colors that didn't have names in human language, and something that looked suspiciously like interpretive dancing performed by several gaseous species, who apparently communicated through controlled atmospheric disturbances. By the ancient accords of the Galactic Coalition, announced the Vorthan Chancellor, in a voice that somehow managed to be musical despite coming from a being that looked like it had been designed by committee. We gather to consider the petition of the Human Federation for full membership in our alliance of worlds. Marcus felt a surge of pride mixed with anxiety as the formal words echoed through the assembly hall. Humanity's application represented decades of careful diplomacy, technological advancement, and cultural exchange programs designed to prove that Earth's people were ready to join the galactic community as equals rather than junior partners or protected species. Queen Lyrale rose to address the assembly, and Marcus found himself holding his breath again. Her voice, when she spoke, had a quality that seemed to resonate directly with something in his chest, melodic and clear with an underlying strength that suggested depths of character worthy of her position. "The question before us today," she said, her words carrying easily through the vast space without technological amplification, "is not whether humanity possesses the technical capability to contribute to our alliance. Their innovations in quantum mechanics, biological sciences, and what they charmingly term impossible engineering, have already proven valuable to several member worlds." A ripple of what Marcus hoped was approval passed through the assembled delegates, though with 47 different species expressing emotion in 47 different ways, it was hard to be sure. The jellyfish delegation cycled through a rapid sequence of colors that might have been applause or possibly indigestion, while something that looked like a mobile crystal formation began emitting harmonic frequencies that sounded vaguely positive. "The question," Queen Lyrale continued, her silver-blue eyes scanning the assembly with the kind of attention that made Marcus feel like she was seeing not just the crowd but each individual within it, "is whether humanity can adapt to the collaborative nature of coalition governance, whether they can balance their remarkable individual initiative with the collective wisdom that has kept our alliance stable for over 3 millennia." Marcus realized he was staring and forced himself to focus on his security duties, though his enhanced peripheral vision kept tracking the Queen's movements as she gestured to emphasize her points. There was something about her presence that drew attention like gravity, not through force but through the kind of natural magnetism that made you want to listen, to understand, to be worthy of her notice. The political implications of the moment weren't lost on him. Humanity's acceptance into the coalition would mean access to technologies that could revolutionize life on Earth, trade relationships that could ensure prosperity for generations, and protection under the mutual defense agreements that had kept peace in this sector of the galaxy. Rejection would mean continued isolation, potential vulnerability to hostile species, and the crushing knowledge that humanity had been judged unfit for galactic civilization. Marcus tried not to think about what rejection would mean for his own future, for the dreams he'd harbored of exploring the stars, as part of something larger than any single world could imagine. The formal proceedings began with what Marcus was beginning to suspect was the galactic equivalent of bureaucratic torture disguised as ceremony. The Vorthan delegation performed their traditional acknowledgement of mutual existence, which involved a complex series of movements that looked like martial arts choreographed by someone with strong opinions about geometry. The Cromulon representatives responded with harmonic vibrations that made the crystalline walls ring like wine glasses, while the gaseous beings from Nebula Sector 7 contributed what could only be described as interpretive weather patterns. Marcus maintained his professional stance while mentally cataloging the various ways 47 different species could make simple introductions into an event requiring its own diplomatic protocol handbook. When the delegation from Kepler 438b began what appeared to be a mating dance but was apparently their version of a formal greeting, he had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from grinning. Fascinating how each species brings their cultural traditions to formal proceedings, murmured Lieutenant Parker, the security team member stationed next to him. Makes you appreciate how simple human handshakes are. Simple until you realize we're the species that turned greeting gestures into a complex social hierarchy based on grip strength and eye contact duration. Marcus replied quietly, keeping his voice below the level of the universal translators. Queen Lyralei's voice cut through the ceremonial chaos with the clarity of a bell, calling the assembly to order for the formal presentation phase. Marcus found his attention immediately focused on her, noting how the ambient noise in the hall dropped whenever she spoke, as if her words carried some kind of natural authority that transcended species barriers. The Human Federation has requested full membership privileges, she announced, her elongated ears twitching slightly as she consulted what appeared to be a holographic data display. This includes voting rights in coalition decisions, access to protected technologies, and participation in the mutual defense accords that have maintained peace in our region for 3,000 standard years. Ambassador Sarah Chen, humanity's chief diplomat, stepped forward to present their case. Marcus felt a surge of pride watching her navigate the complex protocols with the grace of someone who'd spent years studying alien customs and somehow managed to avoid inadvertently declaring war on anyone. Honored delegates, Ambassador Chen began, her words automatically translated into 47 different forms of communication. Humanity comes before you not as supplicants, but as potential partners eager to contribute to the prosperity and security of all coalition worlds. The response was immediate and varied. The Andromedian Trade Consortium's representative, a being that looked like an octopus wearing formal robes, changed colors in what Marcus had learned was their equivalent of enthusiastic nodding. However, the Cromulon delegation's crystalline structure darkened to what could only be described as ominous storm cloud purple, while their ambassador, Kethvar, rose to address the assembly. The question, Ambassador Kethvar announced in a voice like grinding granite, is not humanity's eagerness to join us, but their ability to control the emotional volatility that has characterized their species throughout their recorded history. Marcus felt his jaw clench involuntarily. The Cromulon critique of human, emotional instability was a recurring theme in coalition discussions, based on humanity's tendency to make decisions based on feelings rather than pure logic. What the Cromulons saw as a dangerous flaw, other species viewed as either refreshing spontaneity or terrifying unpredictability, depending on their own cultural perspectives. Their military history demonstrates a concerning pattern of conflicts based on ideological differences. Kethvar continued, his words creating visible frost in the air around him. How can we trust a species that regularly engages in warfare over abstract concepts like freedom and justice, when more practical solutions exist? Queen Lyralei's response surprised everyone in the assembly, including Marcus. Her voice carried a sharpness that hadn't been there before, and her silver-blue eyes flashed with something that looked remarkably like anger. Ambassador Kethvar raises an interesting point about emotional decision-making, she said, rising to her full height in a movement that somehow made her seem both elegant and formidable. Perhaps we should examine the emotional motivations behind rejecting a species based on their capacity for passion, rather than their demonstrated achievements. Marcus felt something shift in the atmosphere of the assembly hall, not just metaphorically but literally. The Etherian Queen's emotional state was apparently strong enough to influence the empathic resonance fields built into the ship's systems, causing the crystalline walls to cycle through colors that suggested strong feelings being carefully controlled. Humanity's emotional nature, Queen Lyreley continued, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space, is also the source of their remarkable creativity, their innovation in crisis situations, and their ability to form loyal alliances based on mutual respect rather than mere convenience. Kethvar's crystalline structure darkened further, creating patterns that in Cromulon culture probably indicated serious displeasure. Emotional decision-making is unreliable. Logic provides consistency, predictability, stability. And yet, Queen Lyreley replied, her ears flattening slightly in what Marcus was learning to recognize as a sign of controlled irritation. It was human, emotional decision-making that led to their recent alliance with the Centauri Collective, providing crucial support during the Centauri food crisis when more logical species calculated the costs and chose not to intervene. Marcus found himself watching the Queen with growing fascination. Her defense of humanity was more passionate than he'd expected from someone who'd supposedly never spent significant time around humans. The briefing materials had indicated that Etherian empathic abilities made them excellent diplomats precisely because they could sense and respond to emotional undercurrents, but this seemed more personal than professional. The debate continued for what felt like hours, with various delegates raising concerns about human unpredictability, military aggressiveness, and their tendency to form what the Vorthan Chancellor delicately termed irrational emotional attachments that could compromise objective decision-making. Each criticism was met with counterarguments from unexpected sources. Species that Marcus hadn't realized were sympathetic to humanity's cause. During a brief recess, while the atmospheric processors cycled through lunch-appropriate mixtures for 47 different metabolic systems, Marcus noticed Queen Lyreley glancing in his direction. Not at the human delegation as a whole, but specifically at him, her silver-blue eyes meeting his for just a moment before she turned away to consult with her advisors. The exchange lasted maybe 3 seconds, but Marcus felt like he'd been hit by something more substantial than photons. There had been something in her expression, a momentary softening of the diplomatic mask that suggested she was seeing him not as a generic human security guard, but as an individual worthy of attention. Lieutenant Parker noticed his distraction. "You okay, Sarge? You look like you've been hit by a stun rifle set to mild confusion." "Just trying to follow the political maneuvering," Marcus replied, which was technically true even if it wasn't the complete truth. Amazing how complicated it is to ask, "Can we join your club?" in 47 different languages. "Wait until you see the voting process," Parker said with the cheerful pessimism of someone who'd read the procedural guidelines. Apparently, they have to achieve something called harmonic consensus, which requires not just a majority vote, but some kind of emotional resonance agreement among the member species. "I'm not entirely sure how you vote with feelings, but I guess we're about to find out." The recess ended with another musical tone that somehow managed to be simultaneously soothing and urgent, calling the delegates back to their positions for the afternoon session. Marcus resumed his post, trying to maintain professional focus while being increasingly aware of Queen Lyreley's presence on the central dais. The next phase of the proceedings involved detailed questions about human culture, technology, and social structures. Ambassador Chen fielded inquiries ranging from humanity's approach to artificial intelligence ethics to their methods for resolving interpersonal conflicts without resorting to violence. Some questions were straightforward requests for information. Others felt more like tests designed to reveal hidden flaws in human civilization. Through it all, Marcus found his attention repeatedly drawn to Queen Lyrelei, watching how she listened to each response, how her ears twitched when she was considering something complex, how her expression shifted subtly as she processed information that would help determine humanity's fate. There was an intelligence there that went beyond mere diplomatic training, a depth of understanding that suggested she was seeing patterns and implications that escaped less perceptive observers. When the session finally ended for the day, Marcus realized he'd spent more time watching the Etherian Queen than scanning for security threats, which was either a sign of her remarkable presence or evidence that he was developing a serious case of professional distraction. The observation deck's botanical garden was apparently what happened when 47 different species tried to create a relaxing natural environment through committee decision-making. The result looked like someone had asked a computer to design paradise, and the computer had responded by throwing together every conceivable definition of plant life into a space that defied several laws of biology, while somehow managing to be genuinely beautiful in a chaotic, overwhelming sort of way. Marcus had come here seeking a few minutes of solitude between diplomatic sessions, hoping to clear his head and regain some professional perspective. Instead, he found himself surrounded by vegetation that ranged from familiar earth ferns to something that appeared to be a tree made entirely of crystallized music, while breathing air that tasted like a mixture of pine forests and ozone with subtle notes of what could only be described as mathematical harmony. His attempt at peaceful meditation was interrupted when a group of junior diplomats discovered him examining what he'd initially thought was a flower, but was apparently some kind of sentient plant that had been trying to engage him in conversation through color changes and pheromone releases. "Sergeant Webb, isn't it?" asked one of the approaching figures, a Centauri trade representative whose universal translator gave his words a slight musical quality. "We were hoping to encounter a human during the recess. Would you mind answering some questions about your species' cultural practices?" Marcus glanced around, noting that some questions had apparently attracted representatives from 6 different species, all looking at him with the kind of curious attention usually reserved for interesting specimens in a laboratory. "I'm just a soldier, not a cultural expert. You'd probably get better answers from the diplomatic team. But soldiers often provide more honest perspectives," interjected a Vorthan observer whose multiple arms were gesticulating in what might have been enthusiasm or possibly a complex mathematical equation. "Tell us about this concept of barbecue. Our analysis suggests it involves the ritual application of heat to organic compounds, but the cultural significance remains unclear." Marcus found himself in the surreal position of trying to explain the social importance of grilled meat to beings who ranged from strict photosynthetic energy absorbers to species that consumed minerals for sustenance. "Well, it's not really about the food. It's about gathering together, sharing stories, celebrating community. The actual cooking is just an excuse to spend time with people you care about." The assembled aliens exchanged glances, communications, and in one case, what appeared to be a brief electromagnetic pulse that might have been the equivalent of a meaningful look. The concept of doing something inefficient for social bonding purposes seemed to require some discussion among species that had apparently optimized their cultural practices for maximum logical outcomes. "And this baseball activity mentioned in your cultural files," continued the Centauri representative. "It appears to involve complex mathematical relationships disguised as recreational competition." Marcus laughed, surprising himself with how natural it felt to be discussing Earth culture with beings from across the galaxy. "That's probably the most accurate description of baseball I've ever heard. Though most humans don't think about the math when they're watching. They just enjoy the strategy, the teamwork, the dramatic tension of close games." "Fascinating," murmured someone who looked like a walking arrangement of crystals, and might have been taking notes through some kind of internal recording system. Your species appears to find entertainment in artificial conflicts. Queen Lyralay's silver-blue eyes met Marcus's for a moment, and he felt that same strange sensation he'd experienced during the assembly session, like being seen, really seen, by someone whose attention was worth having. "Please continue," she said, settling onto what appeared to be a living bench that adjusted its shape to accommodate her presence. "I find human cultural practices intriguing." Marcus found himself the focus of attention from beings representing 7 different star systems, including the one whose opinion would significantly influence humanity's fate in the coalition. No pressure at all. "We were discussing recreational activities," the Vorthan observer explained, his multiple arms still gesticulating in patterns that might have been sign language or possibly interpretive mathematics. "The human concept of engaging in complex social rituals for the purpose of emotional satisfaction rather than practical outcomes." "Ah," Queen Lyralay said, her ears perking up with what Marcus was learning to recognize as genuine interest. "The human tendency to find meaning in apparently purposeless activities. It's one of their more unique characteristics." Marcus felt like he should probably defend his species against the implication that they specialized in meaningless pursuits, but Queen Lyralay's tone suggested curiosity rather than criticism. "I wouldn't say purposeless, more like finding purpose in things that aren't obviously useful, like art, music, stories that help us understand ourselves and each other." "And the emotional component," Queen Lyralay continued, her voice taking on the kind of tone that suggested she was thinking about something more complex than casual conversation. "Your species makes decisions based on feelings rather than pure logic. How do you reconcile emotional decision-making with the need for practical outcomes?" The question felt loaded with implications beyond casual cultural exchange. Marcus glanced around at the assembled diplomats, realizing that his answer might influence how these beings viewed humanity's application for coalition membership. "I guess we don't really see emotion and logic as opposites," he said carefully. "Feelings provide information about what matters to us, what's worth protecting or pursuing. Logic helps us figure out how to achieve those goals. Working together, they usually produce better results than either one alone." Queen Lyralay's expression shifted subtly, and Marcus caught something in her silver-blue eyes that looked like recognition, as if he'd said something she'd been thinking but hadn't articulated. "An interesting perspective. Many species in the coalition have struggled to understand how emotional decision-making can lead to positive outcomes." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ambassador Kethvar, whose crystalline form created interesting light patterns as he moved through the garden's diverse plant life. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere from casual cultural exchange to something more formal and potentially confrontational. "Your Majesty," Kethvar said with the kind of bow that managed to be technically respectful while suggesting that respect was being offered grudgingly. "I was unaware you were engaging in informal consultation with the human representatives." Marcus felt the temperature in the garden drop several degrees, which might have been literal given the Cromulans' apparent ability to influence local atmospheric conditions through emotional state. The other diplomats began making the kind of excuses that allowed them to leave quickly without appearing to flee from potential conflict. "I was engaging in cultural exchange," Queen Lyralay replied, her voice maintaining diplomatic neutrality while her ears flattened slightly against her head. "Understanding the perspectives of species under consideration for membership is part of responsible governance." "Indeed," Kethvar said, his crystalline structure shifting to patterns that probably indicated something unpleasant in Cromulan emotional expression. "Though one wonders whether such understanding might compromise the objectivity necessary for proper evaluation." Marcus realized he was witnessing something more significant than casual diplomatic tension. The exchange between Queen Lyrale and Ambassador Kethvar carried undercurrents of conflict that went beyond humanity's membership application, touching on fundamental disagreements about how the coalition should operate and what qualities were valuable in potential member species. Objectivity, Queen Lyrale said, rising from her living bench with fluid grace, should not be confused with emotional detachment. Understanding what drives a species' decisions requires empathic engagement, not cold analysis of statistical data. The confrontation might have escalated further, but Marcus found himself stepping forward, his military training automatically kicking in when he sensed potential conflict between allied representatives. "Your Majesty, Ambassador," he said, offering the kind of respectful but firm intervention he'd used when breaking up disputes between soldiers from different units. Perhaps this discussion would be more appropriate in a formal diplomatic setting, rather than during what's supposed to be a relaxation period. Both alien dignitaries turned to look at him, and Marcus realized he just inserted himself into a political dispute between beings who could probably have him ejected from the ship with a word. But Queen Lyrale's expression showed something that looked like approval, while Kethvar's crystalline patterns shifted to what might have been grudging respect. "The human makes a valid point," Queen Lyrale said, her voice carrying just enough diplomatic authority to end the confrontation without either party losing face. "These matters are best addressed through proper channels." As the three of them made their way back toward the diplomatic quarters, Marcus found himself walking between a queen who defended his species with surprising passion, and an ambassador who viewed humanity as a potential threat to galactic stability. Tomorrow's final session would determine which perspective would prevail. The final assembly session began with what Marcus had come to recognize as the galactic equivalent of holding your breath collectively. 47 different species focused their attention, sensory organs, and various forms of consciousness on the central dais, where humanity's fate would be decided through the mysterious process of harmonic consensus that apparently required both logical evaluation and emotional resonance. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood at the presentation podium, delivering humanity's final appeal with the kind of eloquence that came from knowing that the future of her entire species hung on every carefully chosen word. Marcus maintained his position with the security detail, but his enhanced peripheral vision kept tracking Queen Lyrale's location on the Coalition Council dais, noting how her silver-blue eyes seemed to be monitoring not just the formal proceedings, but the emotional undercurrents flowing through the assembled delegates. "Distinguished members of the Galactic Coalition," Ambassador Chen said, her words automatically translated into 47 different forms of communication. "Humanity comes before you today not as petitioners seeking favor, but as potential partners ready to contribute our unique strengths to the greater good of all member worlds." The response was immediate and complex. Marcus watched the assembled delegates process Chen's words through their various cultural filters, seeing approval in the color changes of some species, skepticism in the crystalline formations of others, and what appeared to be active debate among beings who communicated through controlled electromagnetic pulses. The questioning period began with Ambassador Kethvar, whose crystalline structure had darkened to storm cloud patterns that suggested he was preparing to make arguments that wouldn't be particularly favorable to humanity's case. "The human representative speaks of unique strengths," Kethvar announced, his voice creating visible frost patterns in the air around him. "But their history demonstrates a concerning pattern of conflicts based on emotional decision-making, rather than logical analysis. How can the Coalition trust a species that regularly chooses warfare over negotiated solution when their feelings become engaged?" Marcus felt his jaw clench involuntarily, but Ambassador Chen's response was measured and professional. "Ambassador Kethvar raises important concerns about human conflict patterns. However, our military history also demonstrates our capacity for sacrifice in defense of allies. our willingness to risk everything for principles that extend beyond our own immediate interests, and our ability to form lasting alliances built on mutual respect rather than mere convenience. The debate that followed was intense, with various delegates raising concerns about human unpredictability, their tendency to form what the Vorthan Chancellor diplomatically termed passionate attachments that could compromise objective decision-making, and their habit of finding creative solutions that technically worked but violated several established protocols in the process. Marcus found himself increasingly frustrated listening to his species being dissected like a laboratory specimen, their greatest strengths reframed as potential weaknesses. When a representative from the Andromedan Trade Consortium questioned humanity's emotional stability during crisis situations, he had to actively suppress the urge to provide some very direct examples of human crisis management that might not help their diplomatic cause. Queen Lyrale had remained silent through most of the questioning, her expression thoughtful as she monitored the emotional resonance patterns that Marcus was learning were crucial to the coalition's decision-making process. But when Ambassador Kethvar began what sounded like a prepared speech about the dangers of admitting emotionally volatile species to positions of galactic responsibility, something shifted in her posture. Ambassador Kethvar speaks of emotional volatility, Queen Lyrale said, rising from her seat with fluid grace, but perhaps we should examine what drives that emotional engagement. Humanity's passionate nature is also the source of their remarkable innovation, their willingness to sacrifice for others, and their ability to find hope in situations that pure logic would declare hopeless. Her voice carried clearly through the vast assembly hall, and Marcus noticed that the crystalline walls had begun shifting toward warmer colors, responding to the Etherian Queen's emotional resonance in ways that the briefing materials had mentioned, but hadn't adequately explained. Their recent actions during the Centauri crisis demonstrate this perfectly, she continued, her silver-blue eyes scanning the assembled delegates with the kind of attention that made each being feel personally addressed. When the Centauri collective faced agricultural collapse, human responses weren't based on trade calculations or strategic advantage. They responded because beings were suffering, and they possessed the resources to help. Marcus felt something warm and complex building in his chest as he listened to Queen Lyrale defend his species with a passion that seemed to go beyond diplomatic duty. Her words carried the kind of conviction that came from genuine understanding, as if she truly grasped what made humanity worth defending. The debate continued, but Marcus found his attention increasingly focused on the Queen herself, studying the way her ears twitched when she was processing complex information, the subtle shifts in her expression as she monitored the emotional undercurrents flowing through the assembly, the grace with which she balanced diplomatic necessity against personal conviction. As the final arguments concluded and the voting process began, Marcus realized he was witnessing something historic regardless of the outcome. 47 different species, representing civilizations that span thousands of years and countless star systems, were attempting to reach consensus about humanity's place in their galactic community. The voting itself was unlike anything in human political experience. Rather than a simple count of opinions, the coalition's harmonic consensus required delegates to achieve what appeared to be a form of emotional synchronization, their various forms of consciousness somehow aligning around a shared understanding of the decision being made. Marcus watched in fascination as the assembly hall filled with overlapping forms of communication, harmonic frequencies from crystalline beings, color displays from species that expressed emotion through bioluminescence, electromagnetic pulses from entities that thought in patterns of energy rather than chemical processes. The crystalline walls began resonating with the combined emotional output, creating patterns of light and sound that were somehow both alien and universally beautiful. Through it all, Queen Lyrale remained at the center of the process, her empathic abilities apparently allowing her to monitor and guide the developing consensus in ways that Marcus couldn't fully understand but could definitely feel. There was something building in the assembly hall, a sense of collective decision-making that transcended individual opinions and approached something like shared wisdom. In the midst of this alien democratic process, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the sheer scope of what he was witnessing. Dozens of civilizations, each with their own history, culture, and perspective, somehow finding common ground about humanity's future in the galaxy. "She's the most striking queen I've ever seen," he whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them, his voice barely audible above the harmonic resonance filling the assembly hall. The effect was immediate and devastating. Queen Lyrale, whose enhanced Etherian hearing had apparently caught his whispered observation despite the ambient noise, turned slowly toward him with an expression of surprise that quickly shifted to something much more complex. Her silver-blue eyes locked onto his across the vast space of the assembly hall, and Marcus felt like the entire universe had suddenly focused its attention on the moment of connection between a human soldier and an alien queen. The harmonic consensus process stuttered as Queen Lyrale's sudden emotional shift rippled through the empathic resonance fields, creating visible disruptions in the light patterns dancing across the crystalline walls. 47 different species suddenly found their collective decision-making process influenced by the unexpected emotional honesty of a single human security guard who'd spoken his heart without thinking about the consequences. Silence fell across the assembly hall like a blanket, broken only by the gentle humming of atmospheric processors and the distant throb of the ship's engines. Marcus stood frozen, acutely aware that his unguarded moment of admiration had somehow become a pivotal point in the diplomatic process that would determine his species' future. Queen Lyrale's expression softened, and Marcus caught something in her eyes that looked like recognition mixed with surprise, as if she discovered something unexpected and wonderful in the most unlikely circumstances. When she finally spoke, her words carried clearly through the silence. "Perhaps," she said, her voice gentle but somehow reaching every corner of the vast space, "this is exactly why humanity deserves a place in our coalition. Their capacity for authentic emotional expression, for finding beauty and meaning in the most serious moments, for speaking truth even when it's inconvenient. These are not weaknesses to be overcome, but strengths to be celebrated." The harmonic consensus resumed with renewed energy, and Marcus felt the emotional resonance in the assembly hall shift toward something warmer and more welcoming. The final vote, when it came, felt like an inevitability rather than a surprise. Humanity was welcomed into the Galactic Coalition with what the official records would describe as unprecedented harmonic unity. Though Marcus suspected the real story was somewhat more complicated and infinitely more personal than any diplomatic summary could capture.